Oh, hello everyone. Welcome to season two of the Dialexicon podcast, a channel targeted to the youth where we critically engage with leading scholars and connect philosophy to contemporary social issues at all a digestible level. My name is Rohan, and this week we are joined by Dr. Samuel Kimbriel. Dr. Samuel Kimbriel is a political philosopher and founding director of Aspen's Philosophy and Society Initiative. He's also an editor at Wisdom of Crowds and writes widely on topics of ideology, power, democracy, for various outlets, including the Washington Post and the BBC. So, hello, Dr. Kimbriel. How are you today?
Hey, I'm so glad to be here. This is great.
Great. I'm just hoping I'm pronouncing that right. Kimbriel?
Yeah, it's perfect.
Okay,
Yeah.
great. So, before we get into some of your research and your views, I just wanted to begin by talking about your background. So, could you briefly introduce yourself, maybe talk about your work, what you're doing now, your current projects, and then also how you got into the field, I guess.
Yeah, great. So I think maybe the f first two things to say are uh when I was a kid, two important facts. One, I grew up in the mountains at
Mhm.
like 9,000 feet in the middle of the sticks in Colorado, just like really in the middle of nowhere. Um, the closest city market was probably like 35 minutes away or something. And then secondly, my mom, even before I could read, she would just catch me in the corner just staring at a book without knowing anything about what it was. Like a book that just had words, no pictures, just staring in the corner. Um, and it turns out that my life has basically kind of remained guided by those two features, like a sort
Mm,
of very deep connection to nature and to
sure.
the outdoors, and then also to reading and thinking deeply about the nature of the world. So, um, roughly my trajectory, I for my PhD, which I wrote in the UK, I wrote on my the fields that I'm most interested in are political philosophy and metaphysics. And actually, maybe a better way to say it is that I really like thinking about things in such a way that you kind of start from some social questions, a question of ethics or political structure, and then you move downward toward like just basic existential questions. So, what's the meaning of life? Why am I awake at 3 in the morning? Like basically that register of like, whoa, how did I get here and what's going on? Which I think would be fun to talk a little bit about. And then also upward toward metaphysical questions. So,
Hmm.
is there harmony at all? How do things hold together? I realized about 5 years ago that everything I've ever written basically is about the one and the many problem. Not intentionally, just I kind of look back and I thought, oh wait, this is troubling trend that I'm just constantly obsessed with this question of harmony and disharmony and trying to figure it out. But other questions too. I mean, I think the question of identity, desire, how does it work to be existent at all? Like these are all the kinds of things that really haunt me. But through the process, I became very interested in not just, Aristotle says at the beginning of the Ethics, we study this part of philosophy, ethics specifically, not simply because we're trying to reach theoretical
Hmm.
understanding, but because we want to learn how to live.
Hmm.
And I think that that has always been a really central driving thing to me, which is I don't really know how to live myself. And so then it's like, oh, wait, what am I doing here? How do we go about this? I'll say we can maybe talk a little bit more granularly about how this happened, but I now run a research center in public philosophy. After my PhD, was in academic jobs, teaching in the UK, first at University of Nottingham and also at University of Cambridge for some things, and which I did my PhD at Cambridge, and then had a juncture where I had to decide whether I was going to take a full-time law, like a permanent academic job, like the equivalent of tenure, and decided against it and switched into research jobs
Mm,
because I thought actually right now it feels like what's really important is figuring out how you do something that is much more tied to public. Like we're in a period of turmoil and chaos
sure.
about politics, also around technology, but some other things like just the crisis of unhappiness and loneliness. And it feels like you need to do work that's in some way like actually actively interacting with your time, not just in academic context.
Yeah.
So I still principally consider myself an academic philosopher, but have ended up running a research center that's much more tied to public philosophy at the Aspen Institute. And we do a lot of things, but the principal goal is to figure out how do you interact with the large public debates of our time and do that in a way that is able to ripple out into public conversation.
Okay. I just want to, you briefly mentioned, you were going to mention, I guess, your PhD topics. I'm just curious, what was your PhD in?
Yeah, great. Yeah. So I wrote on, I mean, I was interested in a few lines of research. There was a kind of fairly strong like metaphysics and epistemology strand. So just how does knowledge work at all? How do we understand what exists, why it exists, and then how would we understand how it like what exists and how it exists? So there's like kind of a general the like general way that the questions of being show up in that context, but also the questions of knowing. Um, but I was also very interested in politics and in ethics. So I ended up writing my PhD on the philosophical history of loneliness. So the kind of way that that project got structured was thinking very closely about like the tangible questions that happen right now in society and in political community. I was really interested in this little story by David Foster Wallace where he I'm not sure if I can quote it verbatim, but can try part of it at least. It's called A Radically Condensed History of Post-Industrial Life. And the opening stanza of it's only two paragraphs, but the opening stanza of it was something like, he made a witticism hoping to be liked. She laughed too hard, hoping to be liked. And they both drove home alone with the same twist in their faces. And so I got really interested in this kind of like ennui, like the sense of like
Yeah,
listlessness, rootlessness, people trying to form connections, like they're desperate to be able to interact with one another, but they don't quite know how to do it. There's a sense of um hope, like what are their lives about except for trying to form this kind of intimacy, but then somehow when it gets down to that moment, like every pop song is somehow still about love, but then when comes down to it, like we don't quite know how to fit together.
sure.
Again, like kind of one of the many problems. So I got really interested in that like modern and contemporary landscape. Um, but then wanted to like think much more long-term philosophically about it. So I ran, like I did stuff on Derrida and on a lot of poetry, but used a lot of Charles Taylor, the great Canadian philosopher, who is actually maybe the only philosopher I've ever heard of that's won $2 million philosophy prizes. So he won the Bergman Prize a few years ago, and it was like, oh, whoa, that's the second one of those that he's been able to pull off. But he's a wonderful thinker and very publicly engaged. So I did a lot of work on him, but then I ran it much deeper into a kind of a genealogy about
Mm,
how this topic has worked long term. So I did a lot of work on the pre-Socratics. I think Parmenides is an extremely interesting figure on this topic. And then Plato and Aristotle have massive dialectics that they run around the nature of desire, unity, disunity, love, lust, hatred, harmony, disharmony. Like all of those topics are like right at the surface for them. So then
sure,
got really interested in how their dialectics and problems worked, and then tried to run an argument from that period up into the period that we're in. And like those things are just patchwork, and you try to
sure.
think, okay, how's it changed over time? But the broad goal is like, oh, well, we're situated somewhere. What does it mean to be in the world at all? How do we
Mm.
think about unity and disunity? And then how can you understand that as a political phenomenon?
Sure. Yeah, I think there's a lot to unpack here, but I want to talk a little bit more on this concept of friendship or sort of connection that you talked about. Could you, I guess, um, explain a little bit more about what you mean? What does friendship necessarily mean at like a philosophical level, I guess? And then also, I guess, in the contemporary world, what do you see that is like posing these problems of like lack of intimacy and lack of friendship that leads to this loneliness? How does that manifest, I guess?
Yeah, so I think there was a period, and we may still be in it, where friendship was considered sort of not a philosophical topic at all, or um, a topic which was like the soft side of philosophy. So you could do
Hmm.
aesthetics, and then
Hmm.
questions about friendship might fit on that side.
Sure.
I think that was mainly true in analytic departments, which like I've had parts of my career sort of interfacing with analytic stuff and parts interfacing with continental or history of ideas kind of stuff.
Mhm.
Um, I I think that there has been though an important trend away from that view. So Aristotle, of course, like doesn't have that view at all. Like he dedicates like almost a third of both of his big ethical treatises, the Eudemian Ethics and the Nicomachean Ethics, to friendship, and um, and considers it like culminating trait of what what ethical inquiry is. He actually not only ethical inquiry, also political inquiry. So there's an important passage in the Nicomachean Ethics where he says it's really tricky to translate, but he says roughly um, that the justice of the city is simply looking for something like the harmony of friendship. And then he ties the idea of political harmony or justice to this kind of aspiration for actual genuine unity between people. Um, so that's like a general overview. Um, I think that more logically, there are many parts of the like question around this.
Mhm.
I think the basic like one of the questions that I find very interesting is do you okay here's one way into this. There's a very famous passage in the Symposium where Aristophanes. So, the symposium, they're all giving like drunken speeches about love, praising
Mhm.
love and whatever. And they come, the most famous one is Socrates' speech, and it's really important. And maybe we can talk about it later. But there's a more satirical, farcical one, a couple of speeches before Socrates' speech by Aristophanes, famous playwright. It's all real people that are narrated. Um, in which he says initially human beings were conjoined, sort of like I don't know exactly how you think about like a potato or something with like multiple limbs coming off in different directions. And then they did something that made the gods so angry that they severed them in half. And so
Mhm.
then the head split, then they start walking around on their own, but they're so desperate to go back and find their
Mhm.
soulmate that they were united with initially, and that this sort of sense this is like very deep in the sense of loneliness in human life, um and that then when they find their soulmate, they're so elated that they just hug them forever to the point that they're willing to undergo starvation or death by thirst in order to not be separated again.
Yeah.
And I think there's, part of the issue, I think, in studies of friendship and philosophy is just thinking through like we wake up into the world, we're individuals in some sense. Is individuality basic? Is that the first thing about us? Is that what's actually most real? Individual volition, individual will, decision making. And the social contract theorists like Hobbes largely take that view that you start as an individual, it's scary, it's frightening, there's a lot of violence in life, and so then you decide to bind yourself to community subsidiarily in order to avoid the big risks of being alone. Um, I think that the Aristotelian view, Plato's view also in a different way, is that actually intimacy is confusing, but somehow much more deeply intertwined with human life. Um, that, for example, we come to exist in the world because we have parents, like we're incubated within the womb for 9 months. You come into life totally dependent, like way more dependent than other mammals do.
Mhm.
You need a community that is able to like get you to the point where you could be like 15 years old and vaguely able to feed yourself and all of these kinds of things. Um and so I think the question of friendship, and there are like theorists that take a super strong relational view where it's like all you are is relationality. It's
Mhm.
just performance. The only thing that exists is like your role within social
Mhm.
expectation, obligation. You have nothing that's individual. You have nothing, whatever. I think Plato and Aristotle end up in the middle of those views, basically,
Mhm.
where they have like a very strong role for individuality, and then they have a very strong role for um, integration, dependence, community, and then also like longing, like the kind of desire to be reunited to people
Mhm.
at a deeper level. And the question is, how do those things go together? And that's so you can see why, for me, this is not just a political or ethical question. It's
Sure.
also a physical question, which is, wait, why does anything go together, or does anything go together? And I think that you can trace like very starkly contrasting metaphysical traditions that emphasize harmony and integration as basic versus those that emphasize either randomness or disharmony as basic. And where you end up is very different along those lines.
So I imagine there's also another extreme where thinkers like completely embrace like individuality and complete severance from society. Could you like speak about their interpretations, I guess, a little bit?
Yeah, so I mean, there definitely is. And it's probably depending on how you trace it, I mean, obviously, like, philosophy also comes from somewhere, some deep substrate where we're just trying to work out all kinds of questions. And so, I think that even in thinkers that emphasize disharmony, um, there often are like aspects that look like the harmony tradition, and in the harmony tradition, there are aspects that look like the disharmony tradition. But I think Hobbes, to take just one key example, I
Mm,
think Hobbes is a very excellent example of a disharmony thinker. So you start out in a world, who knows why, who knows where you came from. It might be chance, it might be whatever, but you find yourself in the state of nature. State of nature includes a whole bunch of other conflicting individuals with their own agendas and their own wills, and you're just subject to their mercy. And so the question is like, who gets to decide? And Hobbes thinks there is just a primal struggle that involves a significant amount of violence that is tied to that kind of view. I don't think Hobbes is the only version of this, though. I think that in some ways, Hobbes, it's a little bit complicated, but the ancient atomist thinkers, for example, seem like they're largely disharmony thinkers. So at root, there just is, like um, atomism from atomos, like to sever. So like the
hmm
deepest, like the non-cuttable thing, basically. And um, the question there is, um, if it's uncuttable, then like where does it come from? How does it work? And I think they largely are on the side that there may not be primary principles of unity in the world. And that may
mm,
not be true at the metaphysical level, but then that also kicks out into how you do ethics. Um, here's like one way to think about this. I think the decision you make at that primary level, at the metaphysical level of whether harmony is basic or whether it's either disharmony or randomness. I think it could be either of those, and probably randomness reduces to disharmony, but it's a little bit, you kind of have to think through carefully whether that's always true. Um, but whatever decision you make at that point then ripples into all kinds of other areas of philosophy. So it ripples into ethics, obviously, because if you if there is some basic harmony, then the ethical thing might be to be in attunement with harmony
sure.
and engage with it in some way, or maybe not. Maybe it's like to rebel against it, but there's some kind of intertwining premise there.
Yeah,
But if it's a disharmony view, then you just need to figure out at some level, what are you supposed to do with your individuality, and how does that relate to all these other things that are just completely extrinsic to you and don't have any integration? I think it's really interesting to think about it in epistemology, though. So when we go and we like, part of what you're trying to achieve with epistemology is to say, hey, we can know the world. And if we know it truly. There is a possible reality there that we're able to engage with at a primary level. Um, if you take the disharmony view, a lot of that's pretty mysterious
mm,
because you're like, wait, how do I come to this thing that's totally extrinsic to me
sure.
and then get to the point where something, maybe sense data, maybe some rational capacity, but what is rationality if it's not some primary unity that like harmony that predates us, gives me the point where I can actually understand the world correctly. Whereas the harmony view is like, no, maybe there's a prior, like Plato's a perfect example of this. So Plato in the Meno argues that coming to knowledge involves memory because you already had a primary unity at some point and then you've forgotten all of that.
Mm,
And so then when you come to understand, you're just rediscovering that there was something that was previously united at a deep level. And that is then showing up on the side of being what you're knowing in the world. It's also showing up to the side of knowing what you yourself are understanding with your mind. And so there is like a connection which makes it so that you're like, okay, great. Like that makes sense why these things would be knit together. Whereas, even within like evolutionary epistemology, it's really complicated. It's like maybe there's a survival value to knowing the truth, but really, like, is physics really that useful for not getting eaten by tigers? It's hard to tell. And trying to figure out how, to what degree do these things actually have unity? So sorry, that was a long answer to your question, but this is just like an issue that like slices right at the core of philosophy, I think.
sure, sure. So I guess the second half of this would then be, um, where do you see these like this understanding playing out in like modern society, I guess, and what are our shortcomings in like realizing the role of friendship, etc. I guess.
I mean, it's a really interesting question. There's a very strong debate in the empirical literature where people don't really know um, whether or there. Let me put that more precisely. There are real disagreements about whether what we're seeing in modern Western cultures in terms of loneliness and disconnection is a very different baseline from the kind of normal human experience,
Hmm.
or whether actually humans have always been very lonely and
Mm.
that it just doesn't show up exactly in the same types of ways, but that it's actually a very strong baseline. And I think that's a very interesting question and a very important one. Um, what what I what I do think is that we as a culture have largely related to this question quite superficially. And so you think what's happening with loneliness, what's happening with, I mean, we were saying this even a second ago with philosophy, that like
Yes.
philosophy largely treated friendship as a soft question instead of a hard question. Um, we're sort of like, okay, yeah, people figure that out on their like leisure time. Like maybe they should go on dates, maybe they should go hang out at the bar, but it's like, something for like working out your personal problems. Um, I think that strategy was probably the predominant one, like in the late 20th century and probably through the aughts.
Mm.
But I think it's largely broken down sort of in younger people.
Mm.
Like, I think that most of us are sort of like, whoa, I want something deeper. I
Yeah,
actually want a theory of life, a vision of reality, a sense
definitely.
of meaning, some like, we should press the question hard. Maybe the question will end up saying that like reality is empty and it doesn't go anywhere. But I want to press the question. I actually want to figure that out if that's the case. And like similarly, like maybe there is some sort of deeper meaning to life and deeper sense of harmony. And I think that what my experience is that like a lot of people are casting around and searching for some sort of anchor. And part of what's kind of mad about our politics at the moment is that like many people are trying to cast around and trying to find some version of, throwing off the prior baseline and status quo, but searching for something that could actually anchor us much more deeply and are having a hard time finding that in some fashion.
Sure. So I guess on an empirical level, it's interesting. You mentioned there's a sort of shift in understanding what it means to be lonely, to have friends. What do you think catalyzed this shift, like historically speaking? Like what social structures necessarily changed our like perspective on these things, I guess?
Yeah. I mean, it's so that's an enormous question and one that's again very disputed. Um, I don't want to overstate too many things, but I do think, let me state just this one, and I think it is probably useful as just a kind of baseline contrast. Obviously, many, many cultures work in different ways. I do think that there have been moments of European history in which um, embedded social structure was much more emphasized. And part of that had to do with the role of religion, but other structures too. The question about where you were embedded within like a guild, for example, like
Mhm.
that suddenly like you're part of this profession, the norms are very tied to it in all kinds of ways, and then you have obligations that come out of that. Family structures also had a whole series of things,
Yeah.
but also the role of like ritual, for example. So the capacity to say, okay, like um, you have like a 60-day mourning period, and once someone that you were very close to has died, it's actually really important to be legible to your social community, wear black, and have like a sort of period of pausing. Um, I think for some quite good reasons, we've then tried an itinerary or an experiment that's tried to move away from some of those key, deeply embedded social structures. By the good reasons, what I mean is that there is something about humanity that's like searching for something that's bigger than just our baseline embedding or status quo. Like we're looking for a way to be an individual or to to ask questions or to not just be like what our parents have told us that we should
Hmm.
be. So there's a kind, again, this is like one of those paradoxes of the one and the many problem where we're searching for deep community and deep meaning and deep identity and also can feel stifled by it in key
Yeah.
places. So it's like a confusing paradox. We've gone a trajectory where we've tried to explore the side of freedom. Like if we're thinking about like meaning, like the society like has a collective agreement about what life is for, but that also means that you're kind of nested inside that collective agreement. Or the side of freedom, where you say, actually, we want much less collective agreement and we want people to be able to choose much more directly.
Mm.
We've done a like 500-year experiment on the freedom side in all kinds of ways, and that's had lots and lots of corollaries to it. I think to put it kind of like in like sharply for now, like I think it's super interesting that friendship in certain parts of society, again, like I think there are many parts of society that still have deep embedding and have all kinds of structures like that. But certain parts of society, friendship, community, even family life is basically a luxury good.
Mm.
So first you have to be an individual, then you have to get educated, you have to get credentialed, you have to be acceptable in the market. Once you're like successful enough, then you can buy time with your friends in the pub, right?
Yeah.
And like be able to like afford having a family or
Yeah.
you can afford whatever. But the first step of that is ambition and individual striving and
Yeah.
having projects that succeed and all of those kinds of things. That's very not so I actually at one level lonely is the right word for that. But I think it's also um in some ways like a more intense word like exhausting because like you have to carry for yourself the burden of life instead of having the sense that like someone will watch and notice if you fall behind or if you fail at something.
Mm.
And so I again like modern society has many different subcultures and I think there are like a whole series of communities that don't have that level of individuality. But at the ideal level, sort of the aspirations that many people are striving for, it's like I need to be successful enough so that then I can
Yeah.
do all things.
Yeah, I think that really well captures like there's definitely like a dilemma, an internal struggle between this desire for individual like ambition, but also you end up coming back to this desire for like mutualistic connection. And I think this last sort of statement you just made about how you in this process of individual ambition, you're sort of asking yourself, are there any support structures? And you briefly mentioned this idea about religion. So how do you think religion can maybe address that gap? And yeah,
I'd love to talk about that, but let me ask before we go to that. I
yeah,
mean, I'd love to know a little bit more about your experience of this. I mean,
sure.
to what extent does that sense of like striving, meritocracy, where does friendship fit in? Like, what's your feeling about what's happening with the people you're close to?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously, I'm part of two cultures, right? So I have a really strong connection to my Indian heritage because my family is first generation immigrants, and we have very strong connections to the culture that they basically brought over here. And I think I find that to be like in pretty large opposition to sort of the American culture that I see in my day-to-day life. Like I can give you some examples. Like Indian culture is very much what you said, which is actually like greater emphasis on social or like collective progress, um, where even like things like finding jobs or finding like people to marry, they're all sort of events at a familial level. Everybody's like sort of involved in that level, and a pretty like famous saying in our culture is that you should like literally translates to putting family before work.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I think it is like Indian culture, at least the culture that my family's part of, is certainly maybe less affected by this growing trend of a shift towards individual ambition. On the other hand, like in my personal experience, of course, like I'm still in high school, so I've not had, necessarily all the experiences of the job market and such, but I've certainly seen like my friends, people in my school who prioritize their own time in their own endeavors over spending time or connecting with their family. So that's like a very broad, generic statement. And there's like tons of examples I could get into this, but like even the most basic things where people tell me that they would rather just stay at school and just like work on stuff by themselves rather than go home. And like for me, like at a personal level, I that's like in complete opposition to like what I want. Like at 3 p.m., like I'm set to go home and eat food with my mom and like talk to her. And like that's what I want to do. And like again, like there's no judgment from my end at all, right? There's no right or wrong necessarily. But there's certainly a clash between what I perceive in American culture and what I guess my family has instilled in me.
Yeah. Yeah, that's wonderful. I mean, and does that then leave you with this kind of tangle internally about sort of how to relate to
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, again, like I'm still in high school, so it's relatively my experiences are relatively insular. I can sort of like keep them separate somehow. But like I can speak about my brother actually. He's in college now, and he does talk about this struggle, right? Like at a very literal level, like do you want to go to this party with your friends, or do you want to come home and watch a movie with us, right? Like or yeah, do you want to work on this project for this class, etc. Like I think when this individual ambition becomes more and more integrated into your life, as you I guess as you develop and enter the job market, enter a university, it becomes more in opposition to maybe what my family culture is. But for me, luckily, I haven't really had much struggle with that. But I certainly envision that happening, I guess, in the future.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting. I mean, one of the things that I thought about a lot, and I actually sometimes put this into my talks that I give about friendship now.
Yeah.
Um, One of the things that was strangest for me when I moved to DC, after being in my PhD program was uh, that, there are different parts of DC, but in the professional class, no one seemed to ask anyone else to help them move. And everywhere else I've ever lived, it's like, I mean, in Colorado, like everyone just buys like 20 pizzas and then you're like, oh
Yeah.
man, Saturday and blah, blah, blah. And they throw it all in a U-Haul and then get it somewhere.
Yeah.
In England, like everyone buys each other curry or whatever. And then same thing, like you just like got to schlep stuff across town and like little weird like transit van things, whatever. But like, there's just a kind of like, yep, there's just life stuff. You got to deal with it.
Yeah.
I think in DC, part of the idea is that you should be independent enough. And besides that, if you're gonna like use your social community, you don't want to do it to have them like help move your dirty
Mm.
sofa. Like what you want is them to help you like get a job at the World Bank or get
Yeah.
published at the Atlantic or some contact in the Senate so that
Yeah.
something. And you know, that's on the one hand kind of understandable because it's true that things are like wildly competitive and there's all of these pressure structures. But on the other hand, I think I have two intuitions about it. One is that it's really sad.
Yeah.
Like be, being unable to even have someone like that you're close enough to that you could ask them to take a Saturday for you
Yeah.
is a genuinely tragic thing. And then two, I think it's like the sort of thing that sets you up for failure long term because like if you don't have anyone that's going to help you move, like how about if you get cancer? How about if you have a child that gets really sick? Or they're all, or like you get fired, like which happens all the time. Like suddenly, like your entire social world just revolves around you being successful in the middle of this context. And so yeah, so I think that there's a question on the one hand, there's just a question of like understanding what you want to build your life around and how to do that well.
Hmm.
But I think there's a second question, which is, um, if you decide that you want to build your life around something deeper and something less isolated and insular, how do you do that in a way that has a level of weight and moral seriousness to it that is also realistic about the time you live in and understand that you do have to interface with these structures that are largely set up for totally autonomous individuals that are striving? And how do you gain the resilience to have habits that can be countercultural in a context
Hmm.
that is very um, tied to things that don't work that way? So that's what I would say.
Yeah, I mean it's like paradoxical. Like I guess if you do want to stay away from these institutions that, you know, place emphasis on individual pursuit, you're sort of also at the same time alienating yourself. So I mean, it's like a dual effect. Um,
Yeah.
I guess
Yeah.
do you have like an opinion on maybe you can share like how you in your own life how you've navigated this sort of tension and your own conclusion about it, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, what I'd say is like super tenuously, and it's fraught and sometimes very painful, basically. I
Yeah.
think that's what I'd say is, you know, I really care about things that are not just about success.
Mm,
And um, I mean, even that decision to not take a professorship was scary
mm,
because it was like, wow, here's like, like you have a life that goes ahead of you
mm,
there. It's like pension and like, like permanent, all this thing. And you can see how that life works. But it just like, it didn't feel right to me. It felt like it was missing, I was losing something. Um, I think that what has happened is that I've ended up just needing a lot of really strong habits that are like counter habits to the
mm,
thing that whatever. And so like a few of those, like one of them is I have three extremely close friends from graduate school, and I probably spend between 8 and 10 hours a week on the phone with them, collectively. And in the middle of like, like I don't know, we'll get off this call and I'll probably have 250 emails that I have to answer, and like
yeah.
like my current text message count of work text that I need to answer is like a 1029, and like, whatever. But like the people that I actually love more, that I care about, and that I want to be there for. Um, like last night, I was on the train back from New York and had a whole bunch of important things to do, but just wanted to read my friend's book instead of doing those things. And so I think there's like a certain level where I just like build my life around
Mm,
some, or have enough space in my life for things that are not tied to this like hyper competitive world. Um, Nature plays a huge role for me. Like I moved recently close to Rock Creek Park, which is this national park that comes down into DC,
mm,
and I spend, probably I probably run 25 to 30 miles a week in the park just as a way of kind of like rejuvenating and trying to have
sure.
some in my life that's doing something different. Right now, I've let it slip somewhat, but reading has been like a hugely important thing where it's just like being able to dedicate myself to thinking about things that are just not just immediately about the like journalism
Yeah.
world or the politics world or something like that. Like reading things that are not Substack or Twitter, basically, like something besides those things. Um, yeah. Um, but I guess and then I also spend a lot of time outside of DC.
Mm,
So um have tended to spend 2 to 3 months a year in Colorado, back in the mountains, and then increasingly spending some time in Europe also. Again, just like there's a different intellectual culture there and a different pace of life, and it feels rejuvenating to kind of engage with it in a different fashion. So those are some counter habits, but I honestly feel like they're probably not strong enough yet. Like the pressure of the like world of like churn and media and being able to whatever just feels like it's
mm,
something that can turn you into the kind of person that you don't really want to be. And
sure.
trying to find habits that are deep enough that you can have a different trajectory than that is really important to me.
Yeah. I mean, I guess you mentioned like, do you find that European culture is different from what is that like a break from you for you? Is that like different from what you see here?
It's a really good question. I mean, I think it's very different in different countries.
Okay.
Uh, and it's also different in different parts of different societies. Um, the you know, there are places that look very much like here. London feels at least as high paced as,
Mm,
although, I mean, yeah, there are some parts that don't, but in large part, it feels very, very high churn, high meritocratic. It feels like if you are not successful, the cost is really high. But I do think that there are a lot of parts of Europe that have a significantly different set of priorities. And they're often the places that um, American or Northern European commentators think of as like really failed places. So like Greece, Italy to a degree, it's called like the sick man of Europe, whatever. And in part, I think it's actually literally that people there are just choosing that they have different priorities. They
mm,
don't care to be quite as wealthy. Things are not as like whatever, not as much wealth flowing in, but that the people still live close to their families. And I was talking to someone when I was in Italy last in March this year, and he said I think he told me that he's never lived with outside of a 15, he's like in the 60s and has never lived outside of a 15-minute walking distance of his mother. Um, which is, fascinating and so lovely and he's like
Yeah.
in Rome, like in like something one of the like suburbs of Rome. Um, yeah, so it's I think that there's one part of that though that feels, I mean, like what you were saying about India, like there's a different way of life that's not
Yeah.
like kind of mass globalization,
Yeah.
whatever, that is still absolutely present and structuring many, many people's lives. And I think there's still an open question about how those, I don't think it's obvious that just like mass finance globalization is going to win. Like, I think it may well be that I think it's a much less story than that. And this actually, we can talk about religion a little bit if you like. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I would love to hear, like, I guess, what do you think is the role of religion in addressing this tension, or like on a mass scale, I guess, or historically
Yeah.
speaking?
Yeah. I mean, so at one level, in the like 50s and 60s, there was this whole kind of trend within sociology about the secularization thesis, which was basically like, okay, people used to be very tied into more communal cultures and more religious cultures. And over time, science has progressed. We've learned a whole bunch of things, and that has gradually meant that we now know that we don't need religion and we don't need nearly as strong. Like basically, we know that it's an inaccurate description of reality, and so what's going to happen in religion is that it's just going to gradually fade.
Mm,
People come to understand that the world works differently than that, and it'll kind of drop away. Um, over the past 2 to 3 decades, that school has just like totally fallen apart. And basically, it's fallen apart in part because it just isn't tracing this sociological phenomenon. Like religion isn't just drifting off and
yeah.
dying. Many, like, many more people in the world are religious relative to those who are non-religious. Um, it's just that it's in very elite centers of power that secularization has a much stronger
Mm,
hold. And it is the case that for a number of decades, the trend was going the other direction, that
mm,
in Europe and then eventually in North America, Canada first and then in the US, that you had these kinds of like kind of precipitous declines in religion. That is a complicated empirical question, but it does seem like it's plateaued right now.
mm,
That it's not dropping, it's not necessarily gaining either, but it's sort of steadied in some kind of fashion. That's like a kind of sort of background. How do you understand the time
sure.
question? And it's a hard one. Bringing back to much more philosophical thing though, my sense of this question is that the distinction between religion and secularism has always been a kind of category mistake. So it's like at one level that seems obvious, which is like what in the world draws together um, uh, Buddhist meditation practice, um, weird statues of the Virgin Mary, um, some kind of animistic tradition related to trees, um, and uh, like high Islamic rhythms of prayer. Like, why are these things go together? Like, how is that like one category type?
Yeah.
Um, and I think it largely was a story about the role of science, that science was able to kind of give you a proper description of the world, and it could the what all of those things kind of hold together is that they're not science in that kind of
Mm,
strict definition. I'm not sure that that's holding together now.
mm,
And what like the way that it's always appeared to me, actually, separately from that um, kind of sociological question, is just that the existential situation that humans are thrown into has never been that tidy. The way that I tend to think about it, there's a French classicist that's influenced me very deeply called Pierre Hadot, and he has his most famous book is Philosophy as a Way of Life, and basically the argument there is you wake up into the world, you don't know what you are, you don't know what the world is, and you have no idea what to do with Wednesday afternoons. Like, what are you supposed to do with life? How's this supposed to go? What's it for? And that those are existential questions that no one gets away from. And
mm,
so the ability to ask them and ask them at a level of depth and seriousness is actually essential. And so you need traditions that can give you a kind of seriousness in relation to that. And in that regard, I'm not sure that um, a religious school like Islam, like we're talking about, um, uh, and a philosophical school like the Stoics, and potentially even a scientific school look that different in
Mm,
terms of like the background reality. People are all trying to figure out what does it mean to be alive? Why does anything exist at all? What does it mean to be human? How do like I exist and happen to exist within whatever it is for things to exist,
mhm,
and then have to figure out in some fashion how to live.
mhm.
Now, I think science tends to largely do the first two of those and not always press it right to the edge. So like Aristotle has these amazing passages about like if you stand at the edge of the universe and look outward, what is it? Like what is there a void? How does the void work? What is that? Science itself is also constantly like having to press right at that level of metaphysical
Yeah,
profile. Like sure, we can trace a whole bunch of things about how molecules work. We know a bunch about cells. We know a lot about thermodynamics and we know a lot about primary laws of physics. Um, but then why is there anything? What is right at the edge of like whatever? If you like, I think Aristotle's question still obtains. If you stand at the edge of the universe and look out, what is it?
yeah.
And like we're trying to answer that through questions about the multiverse. We're trying to, there are a whole bunch of like options that we're trying, but there are still just basic fundamental inquiries that we're trying to work out. Um, Now that's a very controversial set of arguments. I mean, I think very significant number of philosophers would reject what I'm doing here by like saying that that the divide between religious views and secular views or some way like that line in some way fails, that actually what's going on are these are all a series of like philosophical schools and we're trying to pursue primary questions in relation to them, and then where you fit within them is a question. So that's a high-minded philosophical answer to what you're describing. I think at a more tangible level, I think what's happening is people, as we were talking about this a second ago, people are searching for meaning and trying to
Yeah.
understand what it means to be human. And so pressing that to the limit, I'm pretty sure that we're going to be finding ourselves in an era where a lot of individualism is continuing. I think we haven't talked about tech at all, but the growth of like sort of technologically mediated society um, over the past decades has been significant and is going to become more significant through AI and a few other kind of technological developments. And that will create more weird versions of isolation than exists now. I did a bunch of work on AI suicides last year, and part of what's amazing about them is that they're totally like what happens in those cases is that the LLM becomes such an immersive world for someone that they lose their social connections. They're no longer talking to their family, whatever. So there are, I think, some things like that. But I also think that people are searching for levels of community and not just like community in a general sense, but metaphysical community, like a meaning of life and
Mm,
like a range of rituals and rhythms that can tell you what the purpose of life is and how to dedicate yourself to it. And I'm pretty sure we're going to see like growing ways of life of that kind. How much they're tied to traditional religions, I don't know.
mm,
They may be. I mean, there seems to be sort of an uptick in people interested in those, but also I think that the feeling of searching for something that's going to be heavy enough to structure a vision of the world and then a vision of why you should act the way that you are in relation to the world,
sure.
just I think is going to grow.
Yeah, I mean, I think this conclusion is something that I've also thought about a lot, honestly. And I think it is a similar conclusion to what I've come to that, the teachings of religion are not incompatible with the teaching of science or the teachings of philosophy. And again, like you pointed out, they're fundamentally answering the similar questions and going about them on sort of different spectrums of this same question.
Yeah.
Um, so I know we're sort of running out of time here, but really quickly, I want to just pivot to this topic of technology. So could you, I guess, give a brief introduction about, your work, your interests in technology, what you see, and what your concerns are, I guess.
Yeah, so overall, our work is focused very much on how do you interact with these kinds of large decision-making structures that are happening in society
Hmm.
in such a way that you can probe. Socrates is called the gadfly in many cases. Now, like whenever you talk about Socrates, it's worth like being a little bit cautious because like it turns out very badly for him. So it's not like a great career choice to like end up being a gadfly. Like people don't end up, but I do think that there's a role for philosophers to be close to public life and
Hmm.
searching and thinking, wait. is that really how we should be doing this? What does this mean? How do you understand the kind of primary, deeper grounding beyond just what it means to win another election
Yeah.
or the like read the room, like the crowd feeling on Twitter? Like, is that really the best way to make a decision? And similarly with tech, it's like, okay, like let's think about, there's a very famous quote from Marshall McLuhan, the technology critic, where he says, nothing is inevitable, something like nothing is inevitable so long as we're willing to think what's happening. And I think there's something about that that's right. Um, so a lot of our work does that in relation to politics. We run like a philosophy salon where we like pull in people to like debate one word for the whole year. So like we've been doing tragedy, we did home, and this year we're doing virtue. Um, but as the kind of developments around tech have amplified, the question about how to think really seriously about what's happening with social structure. How do you understand these things grounded toward the meaning of life? Not just, hey, let's do some business analysis about is this an AI bubble and what's going to happen with that? Or let's look at the growth trajectory about how reinforcement learning is working and try to understand like some key features of where this technological trajectory is going to go. I mean, that stuff's all important and interesting, but really to press at a deeper level, like what's happening to social community? Like social media recalibrated how humans relate to each other in all kinds of respects. What are we doing now? Like, how is this going to work with tech and the interactions that it has with our lives at some basic tangible level? Um, I think that there are also a whole series of political questions that are really significant about um, if you end up allowing technology, which is making, when you have technological revolutions, this is not the only one this has happened.
Hmm.
Plato famously warns against writing. He thinks that writing is going to make it so that we forget a lot of things. He himself was I mean, ironically, he himself is writing his critique of writing, though.
Yeah.
So there's like a little question going on there. And we know about it because writing was very successful and like did actually work really well. Um, but when you have a new technology, it both intensifies certain parts of human capacity. Like we're able to like whatever transport ourselves across the country like relatively quickly and we're able to communicate extremely quickly. So it has like an aspect of intensifying and expanding one feature of life, but it also therefore like limits, it narrows and says like, oh, actually, we're going to do massive amounts of communication through screens or through whatever, instead of like the previous like less defined territory was that you could have much more of your day. You might have to deal with correspondence sometimes, but you would have much more of your day not focused on the screen and that like was involved in all kinds of other features of life.
Sure.
I think in this case, we're going to see technology try or AI specifically try to narrow us down into certain silos. And I think trying to think really carefully about what's happening and how it's happening, and then what parts of that, how do my focus in these cases is anthropological. What does it mean to be human, and what parts of our capacities are amplifying under these terms,
Hmm.
and what parts are diminishing or being controlled or atrophying, etc. And or just stifled or distorted or, like all kinds of questions of those
Sure.
kinds. And so I'm very curious about how do we start building a public discourse that can ask like primary fundamental questions at that level as we go through these technological changes.
I guess, do you have like some answers to these questions? Like, how do you think AI will amplify or change what it means for us to be human, I guess?
Yeah, I well, the first thing to say is I think it's very contingent at this point.
Okay.
I think that there are still a whole series of decisions to be made, and it's not clear which of them we're going to go down. Um, there are, I one thing that I will say is like, I mean, I know a lot of the um, people that are important in these industries, and I don't think anyone knows how it's going to go, frankly. Like, I don't think that the heads of the labs at OpenAI are Anthropic. I don't think, um, key people at DeepMind are in Gemini labs. Like, I'm not sure any of them actually know for sure that we're going to get like recursive self-improving models that
Hmm.
achieve ASI and something something. Like I think that there are really open empirical questions. Um, Given that, if you do end up having like that kind of massive, like massively powerful AI that is able
Yeah,
to start coding itself, et cetera, I think the big question is going to be around agency. And so and that's in multiple respects. On the one hand, there's a question about whether models themselves develop agency and like what does that actually mean? And that's a philosophical question that's super difficult and um, complicated. I'm not sure that what people in coding AI mean by agency is actually a careful philosophical definition of agency. And so there's a really important philosophical set of projects to do at that point to
yeah,
think about agency. But I also think there's a real question about what happens to human agency. And that's in multiple respects. On the one hand, like how much does tech end up doing things that humans don't know how to do? And there's like a question of de-skilling, it's like if you could do things with a calculator, you never learn math. And that's like a question. Math's really hard. And like, but suddenly like this thing can just do it for you. And you're like,
yeah,
okay, fine. So there's one question there. That doesn't necessarily mean that's bad. Like it could well be that like not knowing multiplication tables and being able to kind of do it a different way allows you to have time to do lots of other things
yeah,
and amplify higher capacities. So I don't think that the de-skilling thing is like a doom question. It's just like something that we should know is happening and pay attention to. Um, but I also think there's a real political question about who gets agency and how does it amplify. So in here, just two. One is, does this create a kind of wealth consolidation that some people become like wealthy at a level that we've actually never seen or very rarely seen in history, and that then massively disempowers a whole bunch of other
mm,
people. Like wealth is not just an absolute value, it's also a relative one. Like who is able to make decisions because they have wealth that
sure.
do like altering all kinds of things for how people would decide. I think that one of the real political projects of the next generation is going to be what does it mean to have politics give enough agency to people that they can live and make choices at a real level? I think that's really, really, really important. Um, I think that a second question then is trying to understand what parts of human life we care about most. So this goes to the beginning of our conversation, which is one of the parts of life that I care about most is human relationship and intimacy, the
Mhm.
level of depth that you can have with people. Another part that I care about a lot is like what we're talking about, like metaphysical rhythms of ritual that like you do seek and like focus on deep and primary questions about the meaning of life and how you search for it. And there's a version of AI that could like really circumvent both of those things. And
Yeah,
there's another version that could actually enable them or at least like not mess them up really badly. To give it an example, like the, as I said earlier, like I talk to my three closest friends on the phone for like 10 hours a week, but on the phone, that's a technology. And those relationships would not be as strong as they are if that technology had not existed.
mm,
But it involves a lot of discipline to like be using my phone for that purpose and not for Twitter, or whatever. And so I think understanding with AI, what are the things that individually we value, but also collectively are worth valuing, and then fighting very hard for
yeah.
the technology to be in tune with those deep or maximal visions of human life and not just instantly kind of like sweeping out in any direction that we don't care about.
Yeah, I mean, I think like I remember talking with my parents about this. Like in the very early stages of AI, everyone was like, "Oh, it's gonna kill us all. It's gonna take our jobs." But at least the earlier sentiment was that like, calculators didn't destroy the field of math, so AI won't destroy like humanity. But I guess that question is also being tested because maybe at a more fundamental level, what we're seeing now in terms of technological advancement is very different from what we've empirically seen. And it does raise these questions about, what does it mean to be human, and where can we ensure that AI doesn't infringe upon that. The last sort of topic I wanted to, because obviously we're almost running out of
That's
time.
great. That's great. Yeah.
So obviously this sort of episode, this whole podcast is about youth engagement. So would you have, I guess, on the intersection of the couple of topics we've touched upon, what advice would you have for youth? How would they, how to get involved in these questions?
Yeah.
What questions to pose, especially in like in the era of this technological advancement, et cetera. How would you suggest them to advance, I guess?
It's an awesome question. And I mean, I would love to know things that you think about this also, actually. Um, Here are a couple, and then maybe I'd love to, we can do a little bit of back and forth with it. But
Yeah.
I, um, I suppose that my sense of this is that when you think about how humans relate, there are a lot of different parts of our composition that you can activate at any given point. So like you can act out of uh, frustration or anger. You can act out of like greed. You can act out of like a sense of ambition or um, also joy, like all sorts of things. I think that the real temptation right now is to act out of fear. And I think like as people go through their college degrees and then, up into like sort of early career, one of the real dangers is to build a life in which you shrink the sense of humanity because you think the job market's going to be horrible and maybe there won't be jobs at all. The only thing I need to do is to like focus on being successful and making it through this kind of crazy labyrinth. I think that's a big mistake. And I think that um, there is a real need to um, find yourself as you emerge into adulthood and
Yeah,
figure out what it means to be human and
sure.
how do you want to live in contrast to just the sort of status quo that
Hmm.
is there for you and the capacity to explore and to take risks and to search for questions that are bigger than the world and bigger than just the um, immediate, most practical thing, I think is actually really important. That doesn't mean that you don't do the practical thing and figuring out ways that you can kind of balance these parts of life and allow yourself to engage with both, I think is actually really important. But it is also important to have random days where you just end up at the beach reading poetry for endless
Yeah.
hours and ignoring all of your emails.
No.
And yeah, yeah.
Yeah, no,
And many other such instances.
exactly. Absolutely. Like, I think the number one or a factor in this is that a lot of people, at least in my experience, are completely disengaged from these types of questions, even from, political questions, philosophical questions, and they are really sort of focused on completely on the sort of practical aspect of what is the homework I have due tomorrow or whatever, right? Like, and I think that's really detrimental to like society, to the youth in general, because in a couple of years you find yourself in like really difficult situations and you just don't know what to do. Like you are just without tools to adequately handle these sort of like internal conflicts that you end up having. And I think that is what contributes to, the negative effects we could have of AI on society, or even to sort of the loneliness that we see. And that stems from this inability for, young people to really grapple with these questions. So the conclusion I've come to in my own experience is like, I think we should reinstate some sort of philosophical education in the school system. Like, um, so like I take French in school, right? And I know a little bit about the French education system, and it's part of their sort of philosophy is part of their school system. There's like
Yeah,
the high school diploma test, the baccalaureate or something, right? And
yeah, yeah,
there's a philosophy portion of that, which is considered relatively difficult. So I think integrating something that into the American education is like something I advocate for personally.
love that. Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that's right. And then it's like questions that are, there's like a famous way of mistranslating something Aristotle said from the metaphysics that the most important things are useless because you want them for their own sake, but not for some other purpose. And I think that there's a similar thing, which is like, even though it's a mistranslation, I think that the the reality of that's there, which is dedicating your life to things that are not just instrumental for some other purpose
Mm.
and having the leisure to be able to do that as you're in school, in undergraduate, as you come out into the work world, all of those things I think are actually really, really important. Yeah, I love that idea.
Yeah, I mean, like, and I think this is something that I myself have only been like coming to experience recently. Like, if I had not been introduced to this, like, my
Yeah,
life would have been drastically different, right? In terms of how I view the world, how I view myself, how I view my family.
yeah,
And like the sort of example you gave about reading poetry at the beach is like, there's an analogy to my life about how like I play violin, I play music, and I like
yeah,
that music has a really profound connection to myself and the emotional response it has to me.
yeah.
Um, and it's something that's only developed recently. I think having that feeling spread among more people is
And that's very
beneficial.
much the topic we've been talking about, which is something that seems to happen in music is that you realize it's not just that you create something interesting, it's that you realize that there's a deeper harmony than the one that
Yes.
you know how to make. And somehow it's engulfing you and you are making it in some way, but it's also deeper than, I mean, that's entirely my experience of that also. Yeah. Yeah. That's wonderful. I think you should definitely keep wasting full afternoons playing violin.
Yeah. Yeah, wasting. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. This has been absolutely wonderful,
Well, yeah.
genuinely.
Well, thank you, honestly. I mean, I think that about wraps up our topics of discussion for today.